All right, welcome to the conversation. Look, I've talked on TYT 100 times about police training. So what we thought we'd do is we'd bring on an expert about police training and talk with them, both about how they're doing it in a new way, but also I'm curious what the old way was. So Mustafa Tamiz is Democratic strategist, former consultant at the Department of Homeland Security. He was the director of US State Department's Countering Violent Extremism Exchange and Program, and he has trained over 2,000 police officers in Texas on the implicit bias program. Mustafa, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, no problem. So I've got a lot of questions for you in a short period of time. And I'm curious, we might even disagree in some portions here. So let's see what happens. So number one, you teach folks, the police officers in this case, empathy. And you try to teach the community to empathize with the police as well. That led me, Mustafa, to ask the question of, wait, are they not taught empathy normally in police training?
Well, in all trainings, we have the habit of talking at people rather than talking with people. And we find that if you're trying to talk about something like implicit bias, rather than telling people, hey, you're biased or you're not biased, it's better to try to create scenarios in real life type of scenarios and put people in, but put them in the shoe of someone else so they can see things from a different perspective. Because the idea is, if people can understand and walk in each other's shoes, they're likely to have a better understanding and we're likely to get better outcomes.
Well, okay, so I agree with that. And I love what you're doing in terms of training on empathy, making them feel like they're the shoes on the other foot. I mean, I talk about that on the show all the time, not just the case of police, but when we're talking about political issues between Democrats and Republicans. Okay, if it's a story about Trump, imagine if it was about Biden and vice versa, right? And so, don't get me wrong, I love the program, but I do want to ask again though, in a normal training program across the country when police are getting trained wherever it might be, Rhode Island, Alabama, it doesn't matter. Do they get taught to feel empathy for the community? Because it doesn't seem like they do. That's why it seems like they need the program that you're giving.
Well, a lot of times what happens is police officers are teaching the program to each other. So a lot of the mandatory training that occurs in police departments, it is about de-escalation. It's about how to use their weapon. It's about taking command and control of a situation. And most of it comes, like any law enforcement, military type organization, it comes from that frame, like protecting yourself and taking command. When we talk about implicit bias, it's a different type of a topic, and therefore it requires a different type of an approach. And so bringing people in from the outside into the law enforcement world and having them facilitate conversation amongst law enforcement officers about issues that are sensitive to American dinner tables now, as much as they are within the law enforcement community, are really critical and really important. And the best way to do it, as I said just a minute ago, and as you were talking about it, we have to stop talking at people, but really started talking with people and with each other.
So Mustafa, what you're doing is, again, really important, and I want people to understand what implicit bias is. So a law enforcement officer, like any other American, unfortunately, might have subconscious bias, and often does. We almost all do. And so they, on general and on average, think that African Americans are older than they are, and this is very relevant for African American kids who are treated as adults. They think that they're bigger than they are, they're stronger than they are, and that leads to maybe using force too many times and in the wrong situations. So that's very important. But Mustafa, that's not the only issue, right? So, well, you mentioned it right there. They're usually taught command and control, and their safety is paramount. As you were saying that, we were showing pictures of cops who we've gotten used to it, but honestly, they look like stormtroopers. And so I'm curious about that portion of the training. Because to me, and we just did a story earlier in the program about this, where a poor kid was shot by officers, white kid in Utah, but he touched the gun of the officers, and so they shot him in the head, right? And so it seems to me that the training is, don't ever take any risk with your life or your well-being. Just shoot him, kill him, be done with it.
Well, look, I think that these are complicated issues, and I live in Harris County here, and it's one of the largest, third largest county in the country. We have 78 different police agencies just within this one county. So there are thousands of police agencies. Every school district's got a police force. Every municipality's got a police force. Every county has multiple different types of police agencies within it. So we are, we're in a society that has different policings that have different governing rules, and sometimes we mix them all up into one. The challenge of our time is we spend inordinate amount of money in healthcare, but we don't get as good outcomes. We spend inordinate amount of money in policing. If you look at municipal budgets, 2/3 of it is in public safety, but we're not getting the outcomes that we want. So what do, right? You can't walk away from it. You can't say we don't need police. We can't say that the police officers don't serve a very important role in our society. So how do we build a path where, as a society, we get the outcomes that we want, safer communities, and law enforcement officers also feel like that the community's with them. So this is through dialogue with each other. And so I know some of this stuff sounds like, can we all get along? Can we hold hands? But in reality, we are basically, choosing sides. It's law enforcement or the community. And that's not how life works, right? There are challenges. We didn't get here overnight, and we're not going to fix them overnight.
Well, I hear you, Mustafa. Of course we need police. We understand that. Everybody gets that, right? But an empathy is real. What you're teaching is really great, and it's really important. You also talk about mental health, and you teach them like, hey, people might have mental health issues. It scares the hell out of me that is unusual that that's taught, and that seems to be the case. I think most officers are just taught command and control, and then you ask us, the community, to have empathy for the police. Well, on that, it's a mixed bag, right? So do I have empathy for them in this sense that there's guns everywhere? Everybody's got a gun. So their life is, in a sense, is always in danger because of that. Is that true? Yes, right? And you've got drugs, you've got crime, and these are dangerous situations. All that is true, right? On the other hand, no, I don't have a lot of empathy for them because they're taught, take those dangerous situations and just kill people. Don't ever take any risk. If you take any risk, and you know what the saying is, Mustafa, better to be judged by 12 than carried out by 6. So that is not right. That is not right. They're terrorizing the communities because they're being incredibly selfish. So I'm having trouble empathizing with them.
Well, I think you're hitting an important point, right? It is that we have to change culture, right? This is not just about a simple change of something small. We have to change the cultures in police departments, and we have to change cultures in our communities, how we see police. And so that type of reform is not just cutting at the margins. There's some transformative things that have to occur in the coming decades. So yes, changes, reform has to happen. One training program not going to solve everything. Do we need to take a look at how we deploy police? Yes. But I'll give you something very simple that we do in our training. The generation that's growing up today, the younger generation, they're native to these phones, right? So every time you have a question, you can ask a question, and the generation that's growing up now, they're used to engaging with people and asking questions. If you grew up in my generation or even the earlier ones, you saw a police officer, you didn't ask any questions. So it's not just about diversity, but how different generations respond to just a simple matter of asking questions. And that has to be talked about amongst people and professionals. And police officers are professionals, so as you were saying, they have a higher burden. They have the responsibility to be trained. So understanding that people that are native to technology are going to ask questions because they say, "Hey, Google," to every single thing. And so when you're in a command and control environment and you want to take control of a situation and somebody asks you a question, an older person would just be chilled, as they say, right? But a younger person might want to ask questions, but them asking questions doesn't mean that they're pushing back. And these are types of discussions that we try to facilitate amongst police officers themselves, rather than just talk at them or just give them a PowerPoint. But these type of facilitated discussions help change the culture in the locker room, in a squad car, when police officers are deployed and working together.
Yeah, Mustafa, look, but again, your program is great and it's definitely heading in the right direction. But I gotta say, even in your description, I think the core of the culture of policing in this country is just terrible. Because like the younger generations ask questions. Well, they got a right to ask questions. That's a constitutional right. In the older generations, we had a right too. But we're just so terrorized by the cops that we knew that if you ask a cop a question, he could bust you over the head. Well, that's a terrible culture, terrible. And it's been here for decade after decade. And yes, they do it more to minorities, but they also do it to white people. They do it to everybody because they're taught command and control. Not every situation is a kumbaya moment. I get it. Cops have sometimes are in dangerous situations and they have to give clear orders and they don't have time to have a discussion. I understand that. We all understand that. We're adults, right? But at the same time, we know it. Utah, we just did another story where Utah passed a law saying that if you insult a police officer, they can arrest you on hate crime and terrorizing police. And one 19-year-old girl got arrested for smirking at a police officer. So look, Mustafa, how in the world do we do mass retraining of our police on a completely different level where we tell them, no, not every situation is command and control. Yes, people are allowed to ask you questions, and no, you must take some degree of risk. You're a police officer, you have a gun, you have a badge, you have the force of law. You must take some risk. You cannot shoot the minute you think there's a slight danger. How do we do that on a mass scale?
Well, look. I think that the George Floyd Act that Congresswoman Bass and Cory Booker, Senator Booker, and others are working on is really the beginning of those type of conversations, where you need national legislation that creates some guardrails that says, if you do this, there's severe consequences, right? You've got to have that, because that's how we operate in our society. That's how police operate, right? Like there's certain rules. You don't follow the rules, you go to jail. That has to take place, and so that's an important element of that. Then if you're going to change cultures in large organizations, whether they're schools, whether they're police departments, that there's an element of training. It doesn't solve everything, but there's an element of training. And then lastly, I'll say it's a leadership. I think we need a change in leadership, and that next generation of police leaders are going to have to insist on it and begin to demand that change. And that just doesn't come from Washington or your state capital or the mayor's office in your town. It comes from all of us. And the kinds of questions that you're asking, the kinds of questions that people are asking on the streets, the protests that have brought us here, those are the critical changes that drive society to do better. And police officers are professionals. They should be held to a higher standard. I think police officers will agree with that. At the same time, I would always say that we as a community have some responsibility, because we didn't get here just by the police. We have brought ourselves here because there's this sense of security over everything else, and that has to change amongst our communities as well.
Okay, Mustafa, to me, is doing great work in this field. We appreciate you joining us, and I got a lot out of the conversation, but I'll end on this. I think but you also have to do it at the top, and the President of the United States and other leaders have to say, we have to stop shooting people. You've got to take a little bit more risk. You do, yes. We're asking you to do a tough job, and that involves risk. But we cannot have you shooting at first sight. And so until you start changing that in a cultural way, you really are not ever going to get to the right results. So again, thank you, Mustafa, for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.